opportunity. Being fair is showing justice and equality.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's always good to see you, which I can't through this video, but I do look forward to our class this coming week, in which we'll discuss the content of our next two videos, Rawlsian accommodation and impartiality, and then Iris Marion Young's critique of impartiality and her politics of difference. Okay, so let's start with Rawls. Well, one question that all of our authors ask is, how do liberals, i.e. rights-based theorists, think about culture? And you've seen most of the culture theorists that we've studied have built their theories around critiques of, quote, Enlightenment liberalism. But last week we saw one Enlightenment non-liberal, Rousseau, and one Enlightenment liberal, and we saw that perhaps their views of culture are not quite so scary, not quite as extreme as the critics say. They value reason, without a doubt, but not at the expense of non-Western cultures per se. Indeed, they actually intend to use the concept of reason as a critique of Western cultures first and foremost. And they don't celebrate reason at the expense of moral emotions like compassion. But in this first video, we'll be asking, how do modern liberals build upon the ideas of somebody like Locke? In other words, what is the modern liberal idea of culture? And as we address Rawls, we'll be asking in particular, most importantly, how have modern liberals, very much unlike Locke, come to the conclusion that we should, in fact, accommodate cultural differences, at least of some sorts? And then with Iris Marion Young, we'll be asking the question, what's wrong with liberal accommodationism? Okay, so let's start with Rawls's idea of cultural difference, and especially what he thinks are the sources of it. He thinks that if you can find the sources of cultural difference, you'll find the source of political disagreement in culture today, and then you can accommodate reasonable disagreements much more readily. Since you know where they come from, in other words, you can kind of defang them in a certain sense. So to start off in our discussion of this, we'll actually first look at our core hashtag puzzle for this lecture, which I'm going to put in front of you on a graphic right now. We'll call this Rawls's liberal principle of legitimacy because, well, that's what he calls it. It's from a part you didn't read, but let's analyze it together for a second and see how it enlightens us on the questions we are asking in this course. He says, we assume that the diversity of reasonable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines found in democratic societies is a permanent feature of the public culture and not a mere historical condition soon to pass away. Okay, and let's make sure that we think here that that's not just a throwaway line. If he's saying the sources of these disagreements are not merely historical, but trace themselves to a public culture, maybe he's giving a systemic explanation of them. Granted all this, we ask, when may citizens, by their vote, properly exercise their coercive political power over one another when fundamental questions are at stake? Or in the light of what principles and ideals must we exercise that power if our doing so is to be justifiable to others as free and equal? To this question, political liberalism replies, our exercise of political power is proper and hence justifiable only when it is exercised in accordance with a constitution, the essentials of which all citizens may reasonably be expected to endorse in the light of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. This is the liberal principle of legitimacy. Okay, long quote. Let me help you unpack it for about the next 3 minutes on this video. In particular, we're going to want to figure out what he means when he says the principles should be acceptable to them as reasonable and rational, as reasonable and rational. How does that express a view of the relationship of reason to culture? Okay, so Rawls argues in his book that with the advent of modern democratic societies, especially after the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion in Europe, conditions made it such that citizens of modern democracies are always going to face what he calls a diversity of reasonable religious, philosophical, and moral doctrines, reasonable ones. And the story that he tells about this is in the introduction to the book, if you want to go and take a look at another point, it wasn't assigned to you. the story that he tells actually helps to clarify his principles. After the Protestant Reformation, he says, what Europe faced was basically a competition between a number of religious doctrines that were equally totalizing in their outlook. So that is Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Anglican Church, and so forth. All of these sought to be completely comprehensive, as he calls it. They included principles for personal life, family life, associational life, and even ultimately for political life. They were what Rawls calls comprehensive doctrines. Now, so many totalizing comprehensive doctrines couldn't all coexist in one space. We may know from history that they came to blows over which one should or could or ought to make commands for the person, for the family, etc., and especially for politics. So what you had then was a period of intense conflict for at least 150 years after the Protestant Reformation that came to be called the Wars of Religion. After so much fighting, Rawls says, people became sick of the conflict. They weren't willing to give up their totalizing comprehensive religions, but they were willing to stop doing battle over who would control the state. So they developed the principle of toleration. Each religion would, in some sense, allow the others to exist and their followers to continue to believe what they believe. But what is toleration? Maybe you've never thought about it before. There are actually many different versions of toleration. For instance, in England, there is both an official state church, the Anglican Church, and there's a principle of toleration. There's one comprehensive doctrine that continues to have preferred access to the levers of power in England, but it agrees not to do anything to persecute the others. It tolerates them, with the word here meaning something with the connotation of condescension, right? Imagine saying that I tolerated my little brother being there, right? Toleration in England, especially hundreds of years ago as it began, was more like that. Here in America, folks just opted for a different solution to the problem, and they started to talk about a principle of separation of church and state, especially as this was interpreted in the early 20th century by American courts, not the same way as it would have been interpreted by folks around the founding period, but another issue. Okay, so some Americans came to believe that no religion ought to hold the reins of power within a state. Instead, they said that there ought to be a political sphere which is separate from the religious sphere, and we'll call that the principle of neutrality. Politics stays out of religion, it stays neutral between them. Then public debate is said to be free of religious influence, and the resulting laws debated by the public are meant to be impartial between the religions. So there are actually two principles being stated here: neutrality, the public stay out of religious disputes, and then in turn religions stay out of public disputes, and impartiality, laws ought to show no favor towards one side in any such debate. So it's this uniquely American interpretation of toleration that Rawls is adopting when he says in our #puzzle quote that the liberal state can only enforce rules that its citizens can reasonably be expected to endorse in the light of principles and ideals acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. What Rawls says is that via this American development of toleration, we've agreed to only make public political arguments that appeal to our fellow citizens' reason or reasonableness, a form of reason that he now therefore calls public reason, because it's the reasons that we could all endorse publicly. And then he thinks that each person will find a way to endorse those reasons from within their own comprehensive doctrine. For instance, they could engage in giving themselves religious reasons to support the public principles. And then when we all do this, from within our own comprehensive doctrines, religious, philosophical, or moral, as he had said in that quote, we'll all arrive at some different reasons to agree to the same principles, some different reasons, or what he calls an overlapping consensus, a moral agreement in which we happen to overlap on what we're agreeing to, but not necessarily all of the reasons that we would give as to why. Some of the reasons, the public reasons, we all agree to, but we might use other supporting reasons. So we'll endorse those public reasons, but we'll perhaps back them up with some views from our own religion or moral doctrine, and etc. But you might be saying to yourself, wait, isn't moral disagreement and even war what puts us in the position of needing to invoke the principle of toleration? How can moral agreement get us out of these political problems? Well, Rawls thinks that in some sense, living in liberal times and under liberal systems has caused the holders of all of these disparate, disagreeing, comprehensive doctrines to also harbor some agreement as to principles for governing their political society. And this tells us something really important about how later liberals, the heirs of Locke, we might say, think about custom, tradition, religious doctrines, and so on. Later liberals know that those doctrines and customs and traditions and religions have stuck around, to say the least, but they think that they've been transformed, as Rawls does. It's not, as the structuralists or post-structuralists tend to accuse, an image of the human solely as a reasoner, but an image of a human as becoming reasonable in their endorsement of cultural norms over time and by their participation in liberal systems. Rawls thinks that by participating in democratic societies with neutral public squares, always looking for impartial justifications for policy, we've transformed our own comprehensive doctrines. We have become more reasonable, which Rawls basically just defines as willing to cooperate in a political society. So we've worked out between each other a set of moral doctrines we all think are appropriate for governing our collective life. And the point of Rawls's theory is to condense those public principles into an understandable form, separate them from the comprehensive doctrines that set us at odds, and build from the public principles only. The idea of public reason, which we've already seen a part of, is that democratic citizens must only offer reasons to each other to justify their political positions if those reasons are consistent with public principles of fairness, toleration, and reasonableness that, Rawls supposes, democratic citizens already accept because of the story I just told you. Impartial public reasons, in other words, reasons that do not favor their own comprehensive doctrines. Which means, in a case that we're going to consider later in this course, that maybe if I'm a Christian fundamentalist, I cannot offer religious reasons for my support of a bill, say, banning abortions. I have to offer public reasons, reasons that, in principle even, I think others could accept as well. I can't offer the reasons that move me. I have to offer reasons that move you, impartial, public reasons. So consider the way that Rawls defines the reasonable in what you read for today. This is on page 49. I'm going to put it in front of you. Persons are reasonable when, among equals, say, they are ready to propose principles and standards as fair terms of cooperation and to abide by them willingly, given the assurance that others likewise will do so. Those norms they view as reasonable for everyone to accept and therefore as justifiable to them. And they are ready to discuss fair terms that others propose as well, he's saying here. But what changes will this cause in our public political behavior now that we endorse reasonable, comprehensive doctrines? Well, for one thing, Rawls says, we'll be tolerant. But for Rawls, the meaning of this has now been transformed. Being tolerant is not letting live, but looking down your nose at, we've already seen that. But Rawlsian toleration actually requires now something more than even the older American version of separation of church and state did. And not every American ever agreed with that vision either. But Rawlsian toleration now requires something more. It actually requires that you respect others, enough respect for them to give them impartial reasons for supporting some policy that you support. As he says on page 66 to 67, reasonable citizens will only want to act from a set of principles that they know meet conditions that he calls publicity. So let me lay out a couple of them for you, and you'll see how a notion of respect is embedded in this principle of publicity. So first, the principles of justice should be accepted by all and be known to be accepted by all. Second, he says, Any reasons that went into supporting the principles of justice should be backed up with publicly available methods of science and social science and whatever. And third, the full justification for the principles of justice should be publicly available, or in other words, the justification should be potentially knowable to anyone who wishes to seek it out and justifiable from within a public stance of reason. Okay, in one way of thinking about this, you might say, well, man, that's Locke's dream. You could say that Rawls is stating here, no fundamentalism, just science. No partial cultural views, just impartial views that lots of people can agree on. But that's not really what Rawls is saying. He's saying fundamentalism, if you want, in your non-political life, science and public reason in your public life. And why does he think that we've come to sort of separate our comprehensive doctrines from our political lives? Well, on 56 to 57, he talks about the burdens of judgment. The empirical evidence, he says, the evidence we need to make our moral decisions is sometimes inconclusive, and all of our moral arguments can be tested with hard cases where we may perhaps have to judge using more sort of art and intuition than rational reason giving. And yes, a lot of people have noticed a similarity here between Rawls's arguments about the burdens of judgment and Rorty's arguments about relativism. We'll table that discussion for now. We can pick it up later if you want. But most important, I think, is condition D of the burdens of judgment. Rawls says this. He says, to some extent, how great we cannot tell, the way we assess evidence and weigh moral and political values is shaped by our total experience, our whole course of life up to now, and our total experiences always differ. In other words, he's saying, applying their individual experience to the evidence as they see it, people will inevitably come up with a plurality of beliefs and belief systems or comprehensive doctrines. So you'll notice here that Rawls isn't saying that the difference between Catholicism and Buddhism actually resides in any sort of metaphysical question. He's actually saying these things developed from very human, oh so human processes like burdens of judgment, trying to come to moral judgments in the context of reason giving and science and facts and etc. So Rawls thinks I'll come to say to myself, well, you know, my neighbor, he's really trying hard to know the moral truth, just like I am. Judgments about the truth are just hard. They are burdened for him and for me. So I ought to really have respect for him, the same sort of reciprocal respect that I'd want him to have for me. I ought to be reasonable, in other words. And Rawls is saying, look, given how hard judgment is, only the unreasonable would seek to impose their beliefs. Toleration is the only reasonable thing to do. But here's a question we want to pose to Rawls in the beginning of our next video. Would I have to tolerate my neighbor if he is unreasonable? Do I have to tolerate the intolerant? If not, does that then mean that anyone who uses anything other than reason to communicate with us is therefore unreasonable and intolerant? Does this, if it's true, bias Rawls's theory against people of non-Western cultures who communicate perhaps not with reason giving, but with emotions, stories, parables, and other forms of difference that Iris Marion Young points us to? Come back to our next video and we'll discuss it.